Now that we understand the required disclosure under ASC 842, the final step in our series will be to organize all of our disclosure information to make this as efficient as possible. So the first thing we'll do here is add a disclosure worksheet. And then we'll go copy a header and call this disclosure information. Then the first thing we'll want to add to this sheet are some date inputs. So let's create a section here and we'll call it reporting date information. Now, we discussed interim reporting requirements a little bit in a previous episode. And for the most part, when creating financial statements, you'll be concerned with the full lease disclosures in ASC 842 for annual financials only. But there are situations where you may need to disclose at least some of this information for an interim period. So we want to set this up in a way that can handle any reporting period, whether annual, quarterly, semi-annual, etc. So all of that to say, we'll add both a beginning date and ending date inputs here. That way we can specify any reporting period we want. And we'll just add some placeholders for now. The beginning date can be January 1st, 2026, and the ending date December 31st, 2026. Then finally, we'll add a last input called maturity start. Recall that ASC 842 requires us to present a maturity analysis of our lease payments, where we'll state the undiscounted future payments of our leases and reconcile them to our lease liability. This maturity start date will always be the day after the ending date of our reporting period. We need to capture all future cash flows beginning after the reporting period, so let's simply take our ending date and add 1. Okay, then next we'll need to summarize all the required information for our disclosures. Some information we'll be able to pull straight off our schedules, while other information we'll need to calculate. So let's add another section here. We'll call this lease disclosure information. And I'm actually going to remove the bottom border for this section. And then we'll just copy this over a few columns for now. And then we'll also add a subheading line to this section. So we'll go grab our reporting date information header again, copy this down. We do want a bottom border for this, so we'll leave that, copy this over as well. And we'll see the reason for this as we build it out. So let's now start with the basic information we'll need to pull in for each lease. We'll have our identifier, then our lease name and classification, and then we'll see why this is as we go, but we'll also pull in the termination date for each lease from our lease list. And then for this header row, let's wrap the text, and we'll center align everything after the lease name. Okay, so let's now add our active leases. So we'll need 6 rows, and we'll add the identifier for each. So it will be 1.1, 2.1, 3.0, 4.0, 5.1, and 6.1. And then we'll just format this a little bit. And then we'll use our identifier to pull in our information here. So for the lease name, we'll say equals X lookup. We want to look up the identifier. The lookup array is the identifier column here on our lease list. We want to find the lease name in column C here. If it's not found, let's return the text not found. We're looking for an exact match, and we'll search first to last. Then let's lock our cells. So we want our identifier to remain in column B. We'll always look up that identifier in column B of our lease list. And we'll leave the column of the information we're trying to find dynamic. And then let's copy this over to the classification. On our lease list, classification is found in column K. So we'll just update that manually here. And then finally, our termination date is found in column H. And we'll just format that as a date. So now let's copy these down for each of our leases. And then eventually we'll need to bring in some financial information about each of our leases, and our disclosures will need to include totals as well. So let's add a couple rows here to do that. We don't yet have any information to sum up, but we will. And remember, ASC 842 requires us to separate the disclosure information for our operating and finance leases. So we'll need 2 total rows, 1 for each. First, let's add a placeholder row here. Then the first total can be for our operating leases, and the second for our finance leases. And we'll just give these totals a green background and bold them. Okay, so now before we begin to pull in the different data for our leases, let's put together the templates of our disclosure tables so we have those as a guide for the information we'll need. The first will be our supplemental balance sheet information. So I'm going to add kind of a box here, title it Supplemental Balance Sheet Information. We'll bold that, and then this will be as of the ending reporting date. So we'll link back to that, probably bold that as well, and then let's add an underline to these 2 header rows. Then the first thing we'll add here is the disclosure for our right of use asset balance and short and long-term liability balances for our operating leases. So we'll add a header for operating leases, and let's actually indent everything here just to make it a little bit easier to read. So then under this we'll have our operating lease right of use assets, and then our current and non-current operating lease liabilities. Finally, we'll add a total for the operating lease liabilities, and then just give it some formatting to make it a bit more presentable. Then we'll need the same for our finance leases, so let's just copy down this entire section. We'll update the header. Then for our finance leases, we'll call out that the right of use assets are presented net of accumulated amortization. This is true of our operating right of use assets as well, but recall that for finance leases, we specifically separate amortization and interest expense on the P&L. So you'll typically see companies call out their finance lease right of use assets as the net amount. So we'll finish this off just by updating all of these labels to finance. And that's all the supplemental balance sheet information we'll need to include. But next, recall that ASC 842 also requires us to disclose for both operating and finance leases our weighted average remaining lease term and weighted average discount rate. So let's add items for those as well. We'll start with the lease term. So weighted average remaining lease term in years. And we'll include this for both operating and finance leases. And then we'll copy this down for the lease term and change the header to weighted average discount rate. Okay, so that gives us a nice visual for what we'll need to calculate. Now, the right of use asset and liability information we already have. Everything we need here is already on our balance sheet in our accounting system. But we'll put it on this worksheet anyway. It'll act as a nice check to make sure that our balances in our workbook, in total, do in fact match our balance sheet total. Plus, we'll need the remaining liability amount for each lease anyway to calculate our weighted average remaining lease term. So let's now begin to populate this data. To do this, I think it's a good idea to separate our lease disclosure information into meaningful sections. That's why we added this subheader here. We'll end up with quite a bit of data in this worksheet by the time we're finished. So let's change the color and add a subheading to the first 3 columns here called balance sheet information. And then we'll just add a column here to make it very clear that these are separated. Then the first column in this section will be our right of use asset balance. The next, current liability balance, and finally long-term liability balance. So now let's populate this information for our first lease. Let's start with an XLOOKUP formula. We want to find the balance as of our reporting date. So we'll look up that value in our inputs here. Then we will find that date in column G here of our 1.1 lease. The value we want to find is the ending right of use asset balance here in column S. We'll return 0 if we don't find a value. We want an exact match and we'll search first to last. And if we just look at the value as of December 31st, 2026, you can see we should pull in $102,894. And sure enough, that's exactly what we get. Now let's lock this and then copy it to our short and long-term liability. So for the reporting date, we always want to look in C6. On any of our lease worksheets, the date column will be column G, and then we'll leave the return array dynamic. So we'll copy this over to short term first. So our current liability is found in column N, and then our long-term liability one to the right, and that's everything we need for our balance sheet information. But we do have a slight issue here. If we copy our formulas down, we'll be looking at our 1.1 lease worksheet on every row instead of the lease that corresponds to the row. So let's end here for this episode, and then we'll pick up how to handle this in the next.